the basic question that I'd like to ask now is, what are we trying to do? What is NAMA intended to do, and if so, will it do it? We're told that it's to get the banks lending again. But even if they were lending, would people borrow? And what would they want to borrow for then? And Brian mentioned that people are most reluctant to borrow at the moment. And why do we want them to borrow anyway? And is it really that we need them to be borrowing to inject cash into circulation because of the crazy money supply that we have? We all know that they're not lending at all at present. But the interesting thing about this is when the peak was reached, I mean, the private sector credit, which is all the loans that are going out to residents of Ireland apart from the government, and that includes Irish resident companies, began to decline essentially at the height of the boom, 2006. There was an early warning there, and now it's gone negative. More loans and interest are being repaid than are being taken out. In particular, mortgage lending has collapsed entirely. It's become negative. But you can see that it was on something of a plateau anyway, but there has been a long-term decline in that. Why was that? Why were people becoming increasingly reluctant to take out mortgages? So, do we want to enable people to borrow again? This country, the private sector of this country, is extraordinarily indebted. Now, when they were borrowing, increasing their borrowings at 30% or more a year, that was doubling their indebtedness in just over 2 years. Even if the banks were in a position to lend, should people be taking on more debt? Let's just look at the figures. The end of July, 94,000 was owed by each man, woman and child on average. So if you don't actually owe that amount yourself and your family, somebody else does somewhere and is paying interest on that amount. And when we hear people bemoaning the fact that Ireland is uncompetitive, it's because we're having to support that huge volume of debt anyway. In normal circumstances, if Ireland still had its own currency, it would be able to inflate its way out of this over-indebted situation. Incomes would be able to go up in money terms, and because debt is in money terms, we would be able to get on top of the problem. But that tool has now been lost. We went into the euro, and there is no similar adjustment mechanism within the euro. And so I want to pick up on what Constantine said. I think this is forcing us into a situation that, as there is no adjustment mechanism, we need to default, and it's the honourable thing as far as the people of the country are concerned to default, that we won't be able to overcome this debt burden. Why in particular? Because I don't believe that growth will ever resume at a rapid level again. Because if you don't get inflation, the only way that you can get on top of your debts is for your incomes to grow as a result of economic growth. But we've passed oil peak. There's going to be less and less energy available, and the way that we've generated growth around the world has been by using more and more fossil energy. That's not going to be available because of resource constraints, and also as a result of whatever measures the world takes for climate change. So we're going into a completely different world, and when we're considering taking on debt, we need to consider that if we take it on in money terms and our incomes are shrinking because there's less and less energy, it's going to become progressively difficult to service that debt. Now, it may have been true that Ireland could have serviced that level of debt at the height of the boom when everybody was working, but now we're going down. That debt becomes insupportable. Look how household debt grew between 2003 and 2006. Ireland is on the right-hand side. The little yellow dot, for those that can see it, represents the level in 2003, and it doubled by 2006. That's the debt burden on each household. That level is at least still there. We haven't got over that. But as people lose their incomes, it's becoming increasingly insupportable. Private sector debt in Ireland, as a proportion of national income, is higher than more or less anywhere else amongst OECD countries. Unfortunately, you can't see the legend underneath. Our debt has doubled since 1997. The governments and politicians, until quite recently, were talking about how low Ireland's debt was. They were thinking of the public debt. But what happened was that the ratio of private debt to national income in fact tripled. So while public debt was coming down, private debt was increasing. Now the thing about private debt is that you can't roll it over, that you've got to repay it, and on top of that you've got to pay the interest on it. So the burden is roughly twice as heavy as it is for public debt. So what was happening, of course, was that the government was borrowing vicariously. The property sector was making so much money, and people were borrowing for the property sector, that when they paid their stamp duties and the VAT, the wages generated by the property activity, that was borrowed money that the private sector had borrowed, that the public sector was taking over. Now the public sector isn't borrowing, but now the private sector isn't borrowing, but the public sector is also balking at borrowing too, and is cutting back. That is going to make the economy very much worse. It's not going to improve things at all.